Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our today's session. This is Somova Basu, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, and we are back with another book discussion today. So today, this evening, we have with us eminent historian, Cold War and US foreign policy expert, Professor Melvyn Leffler. Professor Leffler today joins us to speak on his new book, Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush and the Invasion of Iraq, published in January 2023 under Oxford University Press. The year 2023, as we know, marks the 20th anniversary year of the US invasion of Iraq. And Professor Leffler's book comes out with a very significant note. His book is a provocative reinterpretation of an event which he calls the most consequential foreign policy decision of the 21st century and post-Cold War world. Professor Leffler, in his outstanding and must-read book, reassesses the motivations behind 2003 Iraq invasion and reasons for such drastic US foreign policy. When the world is witnessing another invasion today, Professor Leffler's book comes up with lessons for policymakers. Before I start with today's session, I would like to briefly introduce our featured speaker, Professor Melvyn Leffler. Professor Leffler is one of the leading diplomatic historians of the world and is currently the Edward Stettinius Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Virginia. He has authored several books on diplomatic history, Cold War studies, and history of US foreign relations. His award-winning publications include A Preponderance of Power, National Security, the Truman Administration, and the Cold War, which won the 1993 Bancroft Prize. For the Soul of Mankind, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War, which won the American Historical Association's George Louis Beer Prize. In 2017, he published Safeguarding Democratic Capitalism, US Foreign Policy and National Security, 1922-2015. With our other panelist, Professor Odd Ernie Westad, he has co-edited the 3 volumes, The Cambridge History of the Cold War, and with David S. Painter, he has edited Origins of the Cold War and International History. He served as the president of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. He was Harold Vivian Harmsworth Professor of American History at the University of Oxford, and he has served on advisory committees to several committees of the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, particularly concerning the declassification of documents. It is our great privilege and honor to have you with us, Professor Leffler, along with our other panelists, Professors Odd Ernie Westad and Mark Atwood Lawrence, whom I would introduce a little later. Thank you so much for joining us. Without further delays, I would now like to pass on the floor to Professor Leffler to provide a brief overview of his new book and to highlight the key features from his research. The Zoom floor is yours, Professor Leffler.
Well, thank you so much, Sumava. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk about my book. I tremendously applaud what you and your associates are trying to do in terms of the Council for Global Cooperation. And I'm really, really hopeful that your initiative succeeds. And it's a pleasure to be able to collaborate with you and to give this talk. And of course, it's always wonderful to have commentators like Mark Lawrence and Odd Ernie Westad, 2 great scholars who I love talking to and who I know always have lots of things to say about what I'm writing and incisive comments. And they've both made me think deeply over the years about the subjects I have focused on. So today I'm going to talk about my book. And as you said, Sumava, I consider the US decision to invade Iraq to be the most consequential American foreign policy decision since the end of the Cold War. The war and the occupation and the insurgency that followed, as well as the counterinsurgency, the domestic strife inside Iraq, and the bloodletting inside Iraq led to the deaths of over 200,000 Iraqis and to the displacement of somewhere between 7 and 8 million Iraqis. The invasion and the occupation, in my view, ended in tragedy. Tragedy for the Iraqis, tragedy for the United States. It led to the deaths of 9,000 American soldiers and contractors. The war and the occupation will cost American taxpayers over time approximately $2 trillion, $2 trillion. The war, in addition, hurt the United States in terms of its global position. It enhanced Iranian power in the Persian Gulf. It diverted resources from the American adventure in Afghanistan. The war and the occupation divided America's European allies, and the war and the occupation provided opportunities for China's rise and for the onset of Russia's revanchism. The invasion and the occupation, moreover, increased, fueled, intensified the sense of grievance among Muslims. It heightened anti-Americanism, and it actually complicated the war on terrorism. At home, the war and the occupation accentuated political polarization, and the war and the occupation tremendously sundered trust in the American government as more and more Americans came to believe that the administration had lied about its motives for going to war. So the war was extremely costly, and abroad, globally, the war and the occupation were widely seen as acts of American arrogance, as illustrative of America's superpower, and as confirmation of the Bush administration's unilateralism, even though the United States actually had allies in the war, for example, the United Kingdom, Australia, Poland, Spain, Italy, and other countries, but it was widely perceived as an arrogant act of American unilateralism. So my book essentially asks the question, if the outcomes were so bad, why did the war take place? And why did the invasion go so badly? And I try to answer those questions, those critical questions, by stressing 4 key themes throughout the book. Those themes are fear, power, hubris, and administrative dysfunction. That sounds like my book is probably mostly critical. And to some extent, it is critical, but my intent, like so many other books, my intent is not to indict the administration. And my intent is not to really acquit the administration. My book is an effort to really understand why this tragedy took place. My aim is to explain, to assess, to learn, and to extrapolate some lessons. So for the book, my sources include a unique set of interviews that I conducted over about 10 years with all the high-level officials in the administration, except one, that one being President Bush, who refused to allow me to interview him. But I conducted 3 hours of interviews with Vice President Dick Cheney. I was involved in 2 days of interviews with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. I interviewed Deputy Secretary of State Paul Wolfowitz for 5 or 6 hours, and many, many other high-level policymakers like Secretary of State Colin Powell and Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. But I also interviewed some of their subordinates, one of the most interesting being the president's daily intelligence briefer in the year after the tragedy on 9/11, Michael Morrell. I interviewed Michael Morrell for about 5 hours discussing his own discussions with President Bush on a daily basis about what the intelligence was showing. But I always understood that the interviews should just be a minor part of my research source. Interviews, in my judgment, cannot substitute for documents. My interviews, as any reader of my book knows, really do help to enhance the book. They make certain aspects of it very, very vivid. But I always believe that the documents are more important than interviews. And I tried in the course of my research on this book to use as many declassified American documents as I possibly could access. But I also used, and what was very, very important for the development of some of the themes of my book, was the parliamentary inquiry in Great Britain called the Chilcot Inquiry, which was a parliamentary inquiry about why the Blair administration in Great Britain went to war with George W. Bush. The aim was to focus on British policy, not American policy making. But in the course of that investigation, there were interviews with all the high-level policymakers in the Blair administration, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages with Prime Minister Tony Blair, hundreds of pages with the foreign minister, and with all high-level defense and military and intelligence officials. And every time those officials talked about receiving a document, like if the foreign secretary said he received a document from the defense secretary, the parliamentary inquiry had the right to subpoena to secure those documents. And eventually all those documents and all those interviews went up on a website around 2015, 2016. And that website and those documents and those interviews provide enormous amount of information about what American policymakers were telling British officials, what Bush was saying to Blair, what Secretary of State Colin Powell was saying to the foreign minister, Jack Straw, etc. So British documents helped me tremendously in writing this book. I also used captured Iraqi documents, documents that American troops seized in Baghdad after the war was over. And many of these, or I should say, a representative sample of these documents were translated into English. I do not read Arabic, but I read and used the translated Iraqi documents to help illuminate key parts of my book. And finally, for a very important chapter toward the end of my book about the inspection process inside Iraq in late 2002 and early 2003, I used a lot of printed United Nations sources. So as I researched the book, I saw more complexity. As I researched the book, I also emphasized that I saw more contingency. So for example, the Bush administration did not come into office intent on going to war in Iraq. Many journalists and many writers have claimed that from the time the Bush administration came to power in January of 2001, the administration was committed to going to war. I show with the use of documents that that definitely was not the case. And I would claim that there would have been no invasion of Iraq without the attack on the United States on 9/11. There would be no invasion, there would have been no invasion of Iraq if Iraq had not been led by the ruthless, adventurous dictator Saddam Hussein. There would have been no invasion of Iraq without the belief that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. And as I researched my book, I became both more empathetic to the administration, and at the same time, paradoxically, I also became much more critical of the administration. And I like to think that my book is relatively unique for its combination of both empathy and criticism. In other words, I came to understand the fears and the emotions that gripped policymakers. I came to understand the apprehension, the anger, the embarrassment that the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon had taken place on 9/11/2001 on the Bush administration's watch. And I came to understand the policymakers' sense of responsibility for the attack that had occurred and for trying to prevent the next attack. As I wrestled with the evidence, however, I not only was empathetic, but I also was shocked by the flaws in the policy process. I was shocked by the poor planning, the unwillingness to re-examine assumptions, the unreadiness to think long and hard about the consequences of an invasion and an occupation of Iraq. So as I researched the book, I became more empathetic, more understanding of the motivations, but also much more critical. So I'll take a few minutes now, maybe 10 minutes, to summarize my most important conclusions in the book. And then I'll take about 5 more minutes to talk about some lessons that can be extrapolated from the book. So, I think there are about 10 conclusions to my book, 10 important points that I'm making in my book. First, I argue that the president himself, George W. Bush, not the vice president, Dick Cheney, not neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz, made all the key decisions. Bush made the key decisions regarding Iraq. And actually, he often disregarded the recommendations of some of his most important advisors, like Dick Cheney himself, during the long process that led to war. So unlike many accounts of the invasion of Iraq, I put the president as the decisive policymakers. Nobody who really studies the history of American foreign policy should be surprised by this, that the president was the key policymaker. But what is really stunning in the literature on the decision to go to war is that most commentators believe that the president was not the key decision maker, that it was Cheney or the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld or neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz. Those claims are simply wrong. Bush was the key decision maker. Secondly, I show that the president did not rush to war, as so many people claim. He did begin war planning in December of 2001, just 3 months after the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11. He did begin war planning in December 2001. But what I show in my book was that war planning did not mean war. In fact, when the commander of American forces in the Middle East, General Tommy Franks, when he first met with Bush to discuss the first iteration of the war plan in December of 2001, General Franks subsequently said in an interview, not with me, but with other people, General Franks said, I never got the sense, and I'm quoting General Franks, I never got the sense that President Bush wanted to go to war. That was never communicated to me. That's what General Franks said. And so the point I make throughout the analysis of what was going on in the year 2002 was that war planning certainly was going on, and the president certainly was extremely engaged with the war planning. But war planning itself did not mean that the president was committed to going to war. The third point that I emphasize in the book, and that's very important, is that Bush's motives were not the same as his goals. And Bush was not motivated, as so many people think, by America's preoccupation with Persian Gulf oil. President Bush was not motivated by the Friends of Israel in the United States. And most of all, I show in the book, and this is a very controversial point, was that President Bush was not motivated by a missionary fervor to spread American democracy. Now, I show that if he went to war, if the president decided on war, Bush did hope to spread freedom and to nurture democracy if he went to war. But I also explain that that was not why he went to war. So my fourth point is that Bush's overriding motive was to prevent another attack on the United States, similar or worse than the attack that had taken place on 9/11, when 19 terrorists had hijacked 4 jet planes and flew 2 of them into the World Trade Center towers in New York City and 1 of them into the Pentagon. The whole preoccupation of Bush was to prevent another attack. And I illuminate the mix of emotions and interests and ideas and ideals that shaped his thinking and his calculations after 9/11. What were they? Fear and power, guilt and hubris, uncertainty and credibility, danger and opportunity. I argue, for example, that guilt over 9/11, a feeling amongst policymakers that they had been responsible for not taking warnings of a big attack seriously enough. They felt responsible for the attack that had taken place on 9/11, even though they knew they couldn't have prevented it. What they did know was that they had not taken the warning seriously enough. And they also felt a great fear of political retribution inside the United States if another attack occurred. In other words, they felt that the American people would forgive the administration for the first attack. But if another attack occurred, the American people would never forgive the administration. And they felt an overriding sense of responsibility to prevent another attack. Threat perception, fear, shaped the president's behavior. And I explain why there was so much fear. Because there was no doubt in anybody's mind, the analysts, the intelligence analysts kept reporting that Al-Qaeda intended another attack on the United States. Every day, the president was presented with a threat matrix that enumerated all the threats that had been detected or learned about just in the prior day or two of another attack. And some days, this list of threats that was given to the president, this threat matrix, included 30 or 40 items. And then at the same time, in the United States, in late September and October 2001, just weeks after the attack on 9/11, there was an anthrax scare inside the United States, a fear of a biological attack. Why did that happen? It happened because envelopes that included anthrax spores were circulated in the US mail. And that anthrax killed about a half dozen Americans. And those envelopes turned up in the buildings housing the United States Senate. And fear of a biological attack or a chemical attack led to the closing of Senate and House and congressional office buildings. It led to the movement of the Supreme Court from its usual building to another place. There was a huge fear of another attack with chemical and biological weapons. And this fear was accentuated when Al-Qaeda camps were occupied inside Afghanistan by American special forces, and evidence was found that Al-Qaeda indeed was seeking to develop chemical and biological weapons. So all of these things increased the fear of another attack. And then fifthly, I explain why attention gravitated to Iraq after 9/11. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, applauded the attack on 9/11. He was the only leader in the entire world who celebrated the attack in his newspapers. Hussein also was reported to be reactivating or initiating his chemical and biological weapons programs. There were reports about Hussein's links to terrorist groups, even if not to Al-Qaeda groups themselves, but to other terrorists. So I examine in my book what the intelligence analysts thought they knew about Hussein's weapons of mass destruction and what they thought they knew about his links to terrorists. So in other words, attention gravitated to Iraq after 9/11 because the Iraqi dictator gloated, seemed exhilarated about the attack that had occurred, because he had links to terrorist groups, because he was known to support suicide missions, and because there were reports immediately after 9/11 that he was reactivating his chemical weapons programs and his biological weapons programs. In other words, there were many good reasons to focus on Iraq. But I also emphasize that just because there were good reasons to focus on Iraq, it did not necessarily mean that there were good reasons to go to war. Now, sixthly, I also show in the book that Bush had a strategy. He and his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, called the strategy coercive diplomacy. In other words, they wanted to use military force to intimidate Saddam Hussein, to force him to allow back inspectors into Iraq, or to use military force to force him to flee, to leave Iraq. I show that Bush tried to implement coercive diplomacy in conjunction with the British. And I outlined the close relations that Bush had with Tony Blair and the close relations that Condoleezza Rice, Bush's national security advisor, had with David Manning, Tony Blair's national security advisor. Now, also, eighth, I show that the outcome of coercive diplomacy was contingent on Saddam Hussein's response. The end result of coercive diplomacy might not have been war. In other words, one of the important points of my book is to show that Saddam Hussein was an important character in this entire adventure, that Saddam Hussein needs to be studied as a critical agent in Bush's decision to go to war. And that is why I start my book with an entire chapter that outlines Saddam Hussein's character and his career. I try to show what were his achievements in the 1970s, and they were considerable. But I also emphasize his failures, his opportunism, his brutality, his pragmatism, his inconsistency, and his megalomania. All of these things were important aspects of Saddam Hussein. Now, ninth, I show why coercive diplomacy failed. What were the flaws in coercive diplomacy? I show that it was launched, that the whole idea of coercive diplomacy was launched without much consideration of how it would play out over time, without weighing the costs and consequences and benefits, and without careful consideration of the end game. I show that coercive diplomacy was launched without clarity about its overriding goal. Was its goal to get Saddam to invite back inspectors, or was the goal really to force Saddam Hussein to flee and to achieve regime change? There was never real clarity in Bush's mind about the ultimate goal of coercive diplomacy. And in the last chapter, my 10th point is to show why the occupation failed. And in this chapter, I highlight the unpreparedness, the dysfunction, the friction, and the acrimony inside the Bush administration. I look at the strained relations between the officials who are charged with running the occupation and with the defense officials like Donald Rumsfeld, who were in charge in Washington. And I show the incredible disparity in objectives. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, cared very little about what would happen inside post-war Iraq once Hussein was toppled and once it was known that there were no weapons of mass destruction there. Donald Rumsfeld did not care about what would happen inside Iraq. But on the other hand, Paul Bremer, the head of the occupation, who President Bush himself appointed, Paul Bremer did care about what would happen inside Iraq. The president did care about what would happen inside Iraq. There was a tremendous disparity between the objectives of President Bush and the concerns of the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. So overall, my book is designed to capture the texture of the decision-making process inside Washington. I try to illuminate the challenges that inhered in the post-9/11 environment, and I highlight contingency, complexity. I try to show the mixture of emotion and rationality. Now, I also think that there are important lessons to be learned. And let me very, very quickly outline the most important lessons that can be learned from a careful study of the invasion and occupation of Iraq. First, policymakers need to modulate their fears. They need to calculate carefully what might constitute an existential threat. In the environment after 9/11, policymakers repeatedly talked about existential threats. Saddam Hussein did not constitute in any way an existential threat. Policymakers conflated the evil that Saddam Hussein personified with a magnitude of threat that he did not embody. So policymakers need to think carefully about what constitutes vital threats, existential threats. Secondly, policymakers need to be able to re-examine assumptions. Their most critical assumption was that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. That assumption turned out to be wrong. And there were many reasons I show in the book why they should have reconsidered that assumption. But policymakers thought they had reason to be certain. Why did they think that? For good reason they thought that. They knew from history that Saddam had developed weapons of mass destruction. He had used chemical and biological weapons in his war against Iran and against his own foes at home, like the Kurds and the Shia. He had used chemical and biological weapons. He had lied about his chemical and biological weapons. He had concealed them. If you were a historian, you would have been influenced by the lessons of history. Those were the lessons that the policymakers learned. Yet there were very good reasons for the policymakers to re-examine assumptions. Now, it's easy to say that, and I'm sure everybody's agreeing. Yeah, it's important to re-examine assumptions. But how many of us really re-examine fundamental assumptions? How many times do I re-examine fundamental assumptions? It's hard to re-examine fundamental assumptions. Yet what I show in the book is that it's critical to re-examine fundamental assumptions when you're going to do something as consequential as invading another country. Thirdly, a lesson. Policymakers need to grasp the limits of power. It was easy for the United States to win a military victory, but it's awfully difficult to use your power to reshape the cultural, political, and social institutions of another country. Policymakers need to understand and grasp the limits of power. Fourthly, policymakers need to curb their hubris. They need to understand the sensibilities and the perceptions of the target population, in this instance, Iraqis. Americans thought, policymakers thought, President Bush thought that Iraqis would simply embrace the American soldiers occupying Iraq, that they would consider the prospect of freedom and democracy their most important goals. They didn't understand the distrust that Iraqis felt for the United States. Policymakers in Washington did not understand the distrust that the Kurdish population in Iraq felt for Americans after the Kurds had been betrayed by the United States for decades. The United States policymakers did not understand the distrust and suspicions of Shia in the southern part of Iraq, who had rebelled against Saddam Hussein after the first Persian Gulf War in 1990 and 91, and who believed that President Bush's own father, who was then president, would support the Shia uprisings. But President Bush did nothing in 1991 to support the Shia. and Saddam Hussein slaughtered many of them. George W. Bush, the 41st president's son, did not understand the suspicions and sensibilities of Iraqis. Their hubris was their sense that Iraqis would have the same concerns as Americans and simply embrace the prospect of freedom and democracy. I show that policymakers, before they make decisions, must analyze the costs and consequences of their decisions before initiating them. I show that policymakers must define priorities. They never were really clear about whether regime change was their primary goal or whether discovering the weapons of mass destruction was their primary goal. And it's critical for policymakers to define and clarify priorities and goals. And policymakers need to also understand how credibility entraps. Coercive diplomacy, the strategy of coercive diplomacy, vested American credibility in certain outcomes before the costs and consequences had been carefully assessed. And finally, policymakers need to carefully link means and ends. There was a glaring gap between the numbers of troops assigned for the combat phase of the war in Iraq and the numbers needed to preserve order and foster reconstruction after the military phase of the war was over. And there was a glaring gap between the tactics, the availability of troops, the kinds of troops that were necessary, and the actual goals of George W. Bush. So finally, when readers grapple with my book, I hope they will ponder, as I often do, whether this venture in Iraq, this war and occupation, were flawed because of its conceptualization, or whether this venture was flawed because of its execution, or whether it was flawed because of both the conceptualization and execution. On May 1st, 2003, exactly 20 years ago, next week, President Bush announced that coalition troops had prevailed on May 1st, 2003, that his mission inside Iraq had been accomplished. Little could he have predicted that 20 years later, on this day, 20 years later, all of us would be discussing and examining why things went so badly, why the mission was not accomplished, why Bush's intentions, however understandable, turned into a tragedy, and what lessons we must extrapolate as constructive lessons for the future. He never would have been predicted that those were the things we'd be discussing 20 years later, but we should, as you and your colleagues want to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for writing such an intriguing book, and thanks for presenting the highlights from your most stimulating research. We now have a lot to talk about, and we will definitely. I would like to remind the audiences that you can participate, and we hope that you participate in the discussion by writing your questions in the chat box, and we will definitely take them up. But before that, I would like to come to our panelists for their commentary and questions on Professor Leffler's work. I would like to start with our first discussant, Professor Odd Ernie Westad. Professor Wested is a scholar of modern international and global history with a specialization in the Cold War studies, Great Power competition, and East Asian history. He studied history, philosophy, and modern languages at the University of Oslo before doing a graduate degree in US and international history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Wested is particularly known for his reevaluation of the history of the Cold War. His interpretation emphasizes the role of the conflict on a global scale and not just in Europe or North America. He also underlines the ideological origins of the Cold War and the long-term effects it had in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The term global Cold War is often associated with Professor Wested's work and has been taken up by many historians and social scientists. In the first part of his career, while Professor Wested was mainly preoccupied with the history of the Cold War, China-Russia relations, and the history of the Chinese Civil War, since the mid-2000s, Professor Wested has been concerned with more general aspects of post-colonial and global history, as well as the modern history of China. And today, he is mainly interested in researching histories of empire and imperialism, first and foremost in Asia, but also worldwide. He's the winner of 2006 Bancroft Prize, and some of his award-winning publications are Cold War and Revolution, Decisive Encounters, Cold War, A Global History, Restless Empire, Empire and Righteous Nation. He is currently the Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University, where he teaches in the Yale History Department and in the Yale's Jackson School of Global Affairs. It is a great pleasure to have you, Professor Wested. The floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sumava. Thank you for inviting me to this event and for putting it together. I'm deeply impressed with what you and your colleagues are doing, and the number of people who are on this call today. So I will be brief in order to allow as many questions to come in from the audience as possible, because I'd really like to hear those questions, and I'd like to hear Professor Leffler's response to it. I also, of course, have to congratulate Mel Leffler on doing what is a fabulous book. I mean, the more I discuss it with students, the more I hear about it from others, the more I hear Mel himself presenting on it, the more convinced I am that this is a significant step in historical terms with dealing with the causes and consequences of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq, but also, as Mel pointed out in his remarks today, a reminder about the bigger issues that we need to discuss with regard to US foreign policy overall. It's an important step because it is, by any measure, the first source-based study of the Iraq War, and really undertaken by a master historian as Mel Leffler is. So anyone who has a chance to read this book, do read it, because it's not just about Iraq. It's about the American role in the world in a much broader sense. So just some brief reflections then, mainly on lessons coming out of my reading of Mel's work. The first one is that, because he is such a great historian, Professor Leffler spends a lot of time explaining why what happened. And it's important to understand that. And we haven't in many ways understood that clearly enough until his book appeared, because of the kind of source material that he can build on for the book. But what also stood out to me, as Professor Leffler underlined in his talk, is just how big a mistake this invasion was. In terms of losses, first and foremost, the suffering of the Iraqi people that came out of this invasion. Iraq had suffered a great deal under Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, but it suffered even more, I think all the Iraqis that I know at least would agree with, after the invasion took place. But it was also a mistake in a much bigger sense, and we are seeing some of the consequences, I think, of that today. By devaluing the international order that had been put up since 1945, devaluing international law, what the United States and Britain, and at least indirectly its other allies did with regard to Iraq, was to make it possible for those who are really out to undo and undermine that order, the authoritarian states of the world that have grown since the early 2000s, both in terms of power and in terms of overall numbers, to argue that what they are doing and the kind of views that they have on how international society is supposed to organize is not that different from what the United States practices. So as the main power that had constructed what some people, mainly correctly, call the rules-based order of the post-1945 world, the United States was also instrumental in starting to undo that order. And that is a massive mistake. It's a mistake for the United States, and it's a mistake for the world. And now with the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian attempted occupation of Ukraine, you see some of the consequences of this. I don't think it was American mistakes that in any way led to Putin making the decisions that he made. But the reactions worldwide to that entirely unjustified and brutal invasion have been seen through the prism of what the United States and its allies did in the early 2000s, especially when you look at the reaction of the global South. I think this may change as more knowledge about just what kind of warfare the Russians engage in Ukraine become better known. We just had a conference here at Yale on Africa and African foreign policy and African reactions to the war in Ukraine, and you can see some of that shift happening. But the initial reaction, which was that this was nothing different from what the United States itself had engaged in, was very much conditioned by the war in Ukraine. And I think that might turn out to be the biggest mistake of all with regard to this invasion. Now, the American administration, the George W. Bush administration, was not the only leaders, of course, who made mistakes with regard to this invasion. The biggest mistake, which eventually cost him his life, in terms of consequences for an operating polity, was of course made by Saddam Hussein himself. The idea that he would be able to ride this storm out, that his constant appeals to Arab nationalism and Arab solidarity was something that would get him off the hook, and that the Americans at the end of the day would not do what they had threatened very openly to do. I think all of these were policy mistakes. They didn't come out of bad information. Professor Leffler's book shows that, but they came out of a view of the world, the kind of view of the world that Saddam Hussein had cultivated for almost a generation, that convinced him and the people closest to him that the Ba'athist regime would survive whatever happened. That's also a lesson for today. Lesson about US power, lesson about what kind of actions the United States would engage in when it saw not just its national interests, as Mel rightly points out, but some kind of threat to its homeland being played out. And I think in today's situation with regard to events in Eastern Asia, this is a reminder also of those who might be, for those who might be on the receiving end of American power, how US thinking with regard to these issues go. Was there another solution possible? My own view at the time, which are more or less the same now, is that the possibility for diplomacy in dealing with some of the issues that the United States and its allies were most preoccupied with had not yet been fully emptied out. I think more should have been done to ascertain the issue of weapons of mass destruction, and that there were time for doing that. But I understand the issues that were brought up on the other side, and Professor Leffler's book, of course, reflects those very, very well. This sense of fear that 9/11 created, the sense that time was running out. As the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, put it memorably, that the fear of waiting for the smoking gun to be the mushroom cloud, to be a nuclear attack on the American homeland. You can understand that. I still think that if you look at this in terms of long-term consequences, some of which the US administration and its allies should have envisaged, again, as Professor Leffler argues, the position that was taken by many who were against the war, protested the war at the time, of making more time available to look at the other possibilities that existed was, in essence, a correct position. Then my final point is about more direct lessons of this for today. And I think Professor Leffler again has this right. The American ability, as long as it's been the predominant power in the world, of thinking in terms of a kind of gradualism and proportionality in terms of threat perceptions, is something that I don't think necessarily has changed all that much since 9/11 and since the invasion of Iraq. And I worry about that. I think the inability, which hegemonic powers often have, to grade threat perceptions, to figure out when something might be a problem for US foreign policy that is not an absolute threat to the United States, that one is hard to do. It's been hard to do in American history, as long as it's been at least aspiring to be hegemonic. It has been very difficult to do for hegemonic powers in international systems before them. And it's something that I think is of essential significance if US foreign policy is going to move forward in a direction that emphasizes more development at home and less international conflict. And that leads me to the point that Professor Leffler made so convincingly in his remarks today, which is really about limits to power. Even if you are on top in the international system, this idea that is often there, not just that all threats are inflated because they are threats that you yourself observe, but also that you have within your power the ability to deal effectively with all of those threats. And I think this was one of the basic misunderstandings that the United States entered into with its invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I think it's one of the most fundamental misunderstandings in terms of US policy with regard to China and East Asia today. This is not an argument, as those of you who know my other writing on that part of the world will know, for the United States to step down from the kinds of responsibilities that it's taken on, at least not over a limited period of time, with regard to Eastern Asia. But it is a very strong argument for looking very hard at what the United States can do and what it cannot do in terms of international affairs, how it can influence Chinese foreign policy by measures short of war, how it can stand up for allies and friends within the region in ways that convinces any opponent, including China, that it would be a big mistake for them to engage in actual warfare. Those are the kinds of issues that the United States should be more preoccupied with today. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing in Washington, just as I saw in Beijing, I was back in Beijing about 3 weeks ago for the first time since the pandemic, is this sense that the concentration on the power aspects, the hard power aspects, the military aspects of international affairs, are starting to gain the upper hand on both sides, both within the United States as still the predominant power, and increasingly in China as the rising power. And the end of this, as we know from what happened in Iraq, and this might be the best lesson of all of it, will devalue diplomacy, devalue attempts at trying to find solutions, which might not be the best solutions, but are better solutions than war. At least in the shorter run, and probably in the longer run as well, which is the reason why I worry so much that this country, that the United States, has not learned the kind of lessons from the Iraqi invasion that Professor Leffler encourages us to learn. So I'll end by that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Wested. And Professor Leffler, would you like to answer a few comments on?
Well, I agree with so many of the things that Arne Wested just said. Let me just point out, one of the sort of ironies and paradoxes that we sometimes forget. So Arne Wested emphasized and I agree with him, that the invasion of Iraq undermined the international order and has led many contemporaries today to sort of acquiesce or absolve Russia, for example, for its aggression in Ukraine, asserting that that's what the United States did in Iraq. What I think we should not forget, however, is that the policymakers themselves, President Bush himself, believed that he was not undermining the international order. And it's worthwhile to go back to the speech he actually gave to the United Nations in September of 2002, when he called for another UN resolution, in which he actually said that the United States was trying to uphold the international order. And what he had in mind was that Iraq had been violating a dozen or so United Nations resolutions and was sort of doing it with impunity. And therefore, if the international order was to be taken seriously, Bush felt the United States needed to insist on the enforcement of the very resolutions that the international community had established. So one has to understand that as a context and really ponder that. I mean, what's different, of course, is that Ukraine is not violating any UN resolutions to justify the Russian invasion. And one needs to, keep this in mind and be a little bit more subtle. But the point Arne Westad is making is a very good point. And that is that it has led so many people around the world, especially in the global South, to think that the United States engaged in a unilateral aggression that has set a precedent for other nations. That is what is believed. But one must also sort of acknowledge at the same time that Iraq was in violation of the international community. And American policymakers thought they actually had a role to play in enforcing the will of the international community. That's all I'll say now. I've already talked too long. So let's hear from Mark Lawrence and all the people who are engaged in watching this.
Yeah. Sure. So our next panelist is Professor Mark Atwood Lawrence. Mark Atwood Lawrence is the professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's also the faculty fellow at the Clements Center for National Security in the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests include US foreign relations, the Vietnam War, international history, and decolonization. He has published 3 books: Assuming the Burden, Europe and the American Commitment to War in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, A Concise International History, and The End of Ambition, the United States and the Third World in the Vietnam Era. His edited works include The Vietnam War and International History in Documents, Nation States and the Global Environment, New Studies in International Environmental History, Beyond the Cold War, Lyndon Johnson and the New Global Challenges of the 1960s. Professor Lawrence is the recipient of the American Historical Association's George Louis Beer Prize and the Paul Birdsall Prize 2006. He received his BA from Stanford University in 1988 and doctorate from Yale University in 1999. It's wonderful to welcome you here, Professor Lawrence. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Sumava. It's great to see you. And like the other panelists, I just want to say a big word of congratulations for all that you've been able to achieve. It's wonderful to see so many people on the call this morning. And it's a real honor, of course, to join a panel featuring great scholars and friends like Mel Leffler and Arne Westad. And of course, I appreciate the chance as well to comment on Mel's really spectacular new book. We just had Mel here in Austin. It was great to see him. And I learned something new every time I I hear him talk about this book or have a chance to reflect on it. You know, among many great virtues of this book, it's an incredible feat of research. As Mel notes at the outset of the book, the available documentary records connected to the U.S. decisions for war is imperfect, but he compensates for this shortage by working so brilliantly with the available textual material, and of course by conducting so many interviews with key players in the story that he tells. And all of this, I think, is a tremendous accomplishment. And Mel's digging in all of these ways, no doubt makes the book easily the most authoritative narrative of the road to war yet to appear. And I'm quite certain that that status will hold up for a good long time to come. As Mel argues, I think, and as Arne has reinforced, the war was unquestionably a profound turning point in American and international history since the end of the Cold War. So understanding that decision is unquestionably pivotal, not just for scholars, but also to ordinary citizens in the United States and in India and all around the world. Mel also, I think, deserves an awful lot of credit for convincingly, at least to my eye, defending a number of interpretive positions that strike me as wholly convincing. He shows that, among other things, President Bush was the key decision maker, as he calls him, throughout the process leading up to the war, and that the president, far from determined on war and regime change, was really uncertain for a long period of time, even as coalition forces gathered near Iraq's borders. Professor Leffler also argues powerfully, I think, that American leaders were not nearly as guilty as the commentary has sometimes suggested of fixing intelligence around preconceived policy. Yet the book is also, at the same time, quite shrewd in its unsparing criticism of the Bush administration for a number of things, including very much the dysfunctional way in which it made policy, its persistent failure to question assumptions, and its hubristic unwillingness to consider the possibility that Saddam Hussein's overthrow might lead not to a peaceful democratic Iraq, but to social collapse and bitter sectarian strife. One thing that's really stuck in my head this morning after hearing Mel speak again about his book is the way in which the administration boxed itself in through its concern for and insistence on American credibility. The administration was probably right by March 2003, it seems to me, to believe that American credibility was in jeopardy. But it seems to me the administration got itself into that position through some very questionable decision-making that failed to keep options open in a way that I think is central to effective implementation of coercive diplomacy in this case, and perhaps in many other cases that we might look at in thinking about the broader pattern of what coercive diplomacy looks like and how it can be made effective. Another point I would make is that in Mel's very sharp portrait of President Bush, the president comes across in very subtle shades, I think. He comes across as a deliberative man, for sure, even an indecisive man, but a man whose deliberations never probed very deeply. So we see Bush falling back again and again in the book, it seems to me, on simplistic generalizations, on emotional gut reactions, and on moral certainty. None of these qualities, it seems to me, in Mel's telling, served the president or the United States, for that matter, particularly well. So I could certainly go on in talking about the many dimensions of this book that I find quite convincing and illuminating. But in the interest of time, and here I really do want to throw the floor open to questions from this this wonderful audience that's here this morning. But let me just raise three questions very quickly that perhaps Mel could address, or others might have these questions or similar questions on their minds as well. So the first of my three questions has to do with the role of fear in the Bush administration's decisions. I was really struck by Mel's repeated descriptions of Bush's emotional reactions to 9/11 and the subsequent anthrax scares as really central to the administration's calculations about Iraq. Mel writes, for example, about a president deeply affected and consumed with worry. Even on one occasion, he describes the president as fighting back tears. And I suppose there's something, human and totally understandable about the president's emotional responses, but it also seems to me that fear clearly obstructed rational deliberation by making the president so risk averse as to tune out deep intellectual engagement with the motives and capabilities of his adversaries, and perhaps of his own country for that matter. And I'd be interested to hear Mel speak a bit about how the role of emotion in the run-up to war in Iraq compared to the place of emotion broadly, but fear in particular, during the Cold War crises that Mel knows so well and has written about at great length in his earlier work. Did fear drive the Bush administration in unusual or particularly extreme ways that other presidents might have been more able to manage, or were they more psychologically conditioned in certain ways to avoid some of the pitfalls that the Bush administration seems to have fallen into? Addressing this question, it seems to me, might be central to a fuller overall appreciation of Bush's leadership against the backdrop of presidential decision-making over the longer haul. My second question has to do with something rather different. It has to do with Mel's assertion that President Bush was always the key decision maker in the run-up to war. I think, as I've mentioned already, that this is a convincing line of argument insofar as it rebuts the frequent claims that we've all no doubt heard that it was really Rumsfeld or Cheney or Wolfowitz, right, who drove decisions over the head or maybe behind the back of an out-of-touch president who simply wasn't, for some reason, up to the challenges of the moment. Yet I can't help wondering, and I'd love to press Mel here just a little bit, if there's any danger in stressing presidential authority to the point perhaps of obscuring the ways in which the bureaucracy or highly motivated individuals within the bureaucracy can drive decisions by shaping the range of options that are before a president. In other words, while I'm willing to accept certainly that President Bush was the principal decision maker, should we also perhaps acknowledge that his understanding of available options was driven by choices made at lower levels of the bureaucracy where officials like Wolfowitz might have exercised outsized importance? To see this might entail going back into the 1990s to see how the Project for the New American Century, or perhaps other groups or individuals with a focus on Iraq, advanced ideas that had sort of become part of the landscape by the early 2000s. And I suspect that Mel would agree with me that foreign policy decision-making is driven, in any case you could probably look at, by a complex brew of bureaucratic preparation and executive choice. But I wonder to what extent he'd agree that understanding Bush's options might require digging backward in time to uncover the ideas that would shape and perhaps constrain his thinking in the months following 9/11. And then finally, I have a really simple question to wrap up on for Mel. Even after the extraordinary research that he has managed to conduct and that makes this such an authoritative book, I wonder, what are the principal areas of uncertainty that remain where we might learn, where Mel himself might learn important new things as more evidence comes to light? What, in short, are the key unknowns or issues that are most subject, does Mel think, for reinterpretation as we learn more in the years ahead? So with that, though I have many more questions I'd love to ask, I'll step aside. But again, only after one more a word of thanks to Sumava for the chance to be here with you today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Lawrence. Yes, Professor Leffler, would you like to answer?
Yes, Mark raises great issues, and I'd love to discuss this with him for about 3 or 4 hours. But in the hopes of leaving at least a couple of minutes, let me say a few things very briefly. And he raises truly interesting, powerful questions. So about the role of fear, I do think that emotion, I agree with him in his suggestion that emotion, like fear, shaped and distorted decision-making. The interesting thing that he raises, and we can talk more about that, but the interesting thing he raises is how would one compare that to the role of fear during the Cold War? And I think the key thing to keep in mind when you ask that question is that the central difference between 2001 and 2 in Iraq and the Cold War was the relative conception of American power in 2001 and 2002. So there may have been equal amounts of fear, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was tempered by understanding that your adversary had huge power. And so it was this combination of fear, power, hubris, and the interaction, the sense that, yeah, we are very fearful, but now in this case, we also have the power to overcome our fears if we just employ that power. And during the Cold War, there was policymakers were often very chastened about responding to the perception of threat with the use of power because of the consequences of using that power in terms of Soviet capabilities. So, you know, that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing that Mark says about, you know, the options and lower and bureaucrats, I actually don't think that you know, subordinates were significant in shaping the options. And, you know, it's often said, and Mark just said it, that the Bush administration came to power with preconceived ideas generated by the neocons who had developed so many of these ideas in the 1990s, and they were just employed. But what people forget and should look at, and I talk about this in my book, is that prior to 9/11, those ideas of the neocons were not the central ideas of the Bush administration. I talk, for example, about the national strategy statement that Condoleezza Rice was actually working on in the summer of 2001, which was very different than the defense policy guidance of 1992, or the Quadrennial Defense Review, the QDR, which the Defense Department was working on during the spring and summer of 2001. That did not incorporate really the ideas of the defense policy guidance. It was based on new circumstances. So I'm not, you know, I don't think the neocons and lower level bureaucrats shaped the process by the way they presented options. Partly Mark, because the process was so flawed. You know, it wasn't as if, you know, it wasn't as if Condi Rice and Steve Hadley, the national security advisors, were really asking for a systematic discussion of options. So, so a lot of it was based on predilections, assumptions, and fears, and a sense of American power. Third question, you know, what are the principal areas of uncertainty? Well, you know, a lot of my book is based on assessments of threat. And what I think we really need to know a lot more about is the daily intelligence that Bush really was receiving. One of the things that we do not have and will not have for decades probably are truly the daily presidential briefs. And to have a sense of what was in those briefs would really give us a better sense of whether the fear was justified or manipulated. So if, you know, I think that's a key issue of controversy. How much was the role of fear and threat perception? And truly to understand that, we need to see the daily intelligence. But let me just one caveat. There were two aspects to the American sense of fear. One was fear of another attack. The other, as I say again and again in my book, was fear that if Saddam Hussein actually developed chemical and biological or weapons of mass destruction over the intermediate term or the long term, the fear was that he would then be able to, quote unquote, blackmail the United States, that he would then be able to compel the United States to self-deter. That is, that the United States would then not be able to exercise its power in the region as it had become accustomed to doing. So there was a fear that the intermediate and long-term development of weapons of mass destruction could also circumscribe the exercise of American power. There are two elements of fear. That's it.
Thank you so much, Professor Leffler, and thank you so much, Professor Wested and Lawrence, for this questions and the commentary on Professor Leffler's book. So I have a question for Professor Wested, and then I would also like Professor Leffler to also highlight, because both of you are Cold War historians. So you have mentioned, we came across the international order. So since Professor Wested, you specialize in polarization and international order, you have written on these aspects in many of your books. So there are many scholars who tend to believe that the Iraq policy of the US was one of the major post-Cold War events because this was the unipolar moment for America. And because the world has just seen the demise of bipolarity and the US was the only dominant power. To what extent do you agree to this? And I would like to know your opinion. Was the Iraq invasion really America's unipolar moment? If not, then why?
Just responding briefly to that, Sumava, yes, I agree with what Professor Leffler said a little bit earlier on, that the absence of any meaningful sense of bipolarity or counterforce that existed within the international system probably prompted some of the US decisions with regard to invading and occupying Iraq. I think there is little doubt about that. If you do a counterfactual on this and you think about this being undertaken if the Soviet Union had been around still to be a powerful ally of Saddam Hussein regime, I'm pretty sure. So that, in a way, and I think this is the direction the questioner wants to go in. You know, does that mean that when you have a unipolar situation, that invites the predominant power to make even more mistakes than they would do under other circumstances? I think there is a point to be made for that. I mean, particularly if this is a brief and rather sudden event, as the end of the Cold War indeed was. It opens up for exactly what Professor Leffler rightly critiques in his book, which is hubris and a sense of being all powerful. I've written about in another book organized by Professor Leffler and others about how I see parallels between interpretations on the US side of how the Cold War ended and decision-making with regard to the invasion of Iraq. And I think that is a striking sort of reading of history, in this case, reading history backwards, that led to the invasion. Now, that said, I'm not convinced that unipolar situations overall, if you think about this in a comparative sense, in a more long-lasting kind of international system are necessarily less peaceful than bipolar systems, which are, really quite rare if you think about it in a comparative historical context, or multipolarity, which is much more common and in many ways the predominant form of organizations among states, I think, over the last millennium, both in Asia and in Europe. I don't think one could easily make that argument, but you can see how unipolarity, particularly suddenly achieved full hegemony, as in the US case, would invite the kind of foreign policy mistakes that happened in this case. We know of many other examples of that from history. So, I mean, this is not something that comes out of a unique constellation in the United States.
Yes, Professor Leffler.
Yes, I would just say very cogently, I do believe that unipolarity was an extremely important contributing factor. I think that the sense of power after the Cold War was omnipresent. And when you put power and fear together, that is a toxic combination, fear and power. And the more power you have, and there was a huge sense, an overwhelming sense of power, the more power you have, the more inclined you're going to be to use that power to deal with threats, even when they're not existential threats. So, I think that was a critical factor. The other thing about unipolarity was the pervasive sense, and this is what Arne Westad in part is referring to, the pervasive sense after the Cold War that the United States had developed a system of democratic capitalism that was hegemonic, welcomed by everybody, universally acclaimed as the only possible system that would bring well-being to all of humankind. And there was this sense, when the Berlin Wall came down, that, Condi Rice, George Bush's father, Dick Cheney, they were all in power at the time, and they all believed that, the cheering in the streets of East Berlin as the wall came down, this was, a decisive aspect of their whole mental mindset. And it was, we Americans have devised the system that everybody in the world wants. And, therefore, this reinforced the unipolarity in terms of power.
Exactly. And I would quickly like to know just one more thing. Like you mentioned in your book about the Tony Blair and George W. Bush's special relationship. So there have also, I was recently reading, and so this was something unusual. Like one was a hardcore conservative, and the second one was someone democratic, socialist, and liberal, and they came into a single stage. So, to what extent? My question is: to what extent the story of Blair being an evangelical crusader and New Labour is viable, and did they side with US for a noble mission, or was it electorate trust? And I recently read this thing, I wanted to share this with you. This happens to be a conspiracy theory, just like the Al-Qaeda and nexus, Saddam Hussein nexus. So this theory suggests that it states that UK wanted to influence US foreign policy choices, and similarly like what UAE and Israel is doing today. So I'm not sure if it is true, but Blair's Labour Party, recognition of US presidents, whether it is Republican or Democrat, was more important, unlike the 1980s Labour. So how do you see this theory, and did you come across any documents particularly on this UK-US ties? So yes.
Yes, very, very quickly, I would say, first of all, Blair and the Labour Party were on different trajectories with regard to going to war in Iraq. Blair was not representative of his own constituencies at all. What's important here is exactly what you alluded to, and that is really the moral and religious sort of sensibilities of Tony Blair that resonated with George W. Bush. I mean, Bush says and Blair says they were both surprised to realize how much they liked one another. And in the context of the threat that existed after 9/11, what they considered their moral sensibilities were accentuated. What's important here, of course, is that Tony Blair understood that he was out on a limb in terms of what the British people wanted, what his own Labour Party wanted. And although he absolutely was preoccupied with the nexus of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, of course, he was skeptical of the direct relationship between Saddam Hussein and 9/11, Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So was George W. Bush skeptical, but they were both incredibly worried about what would happen if weapons of mass destruction fell into the hands of any terrorist group that might employ that. But Bush, as I write in my book, and what's an important factor, and I think is a very controversial point of my book, Blair says to Bush, if Saddam Hussein capitulates or agrees to inspections and cooperates, we Brits and Americans need to take yes for an answer. If Saddam Hussein really does cooperate and opens up Iraq and relinquishes his alleged weapons, then we must allow him to stay in power. Then regime change becomes the subordinate objective. And he pressed that on George W. Bush. And Bush, according to my interpretation and according to British records, Bush acquiesced and accepted. And Bush said, yes, if Hussein really does cooperate and reveal and relinquish his weapons of mass destruction, I'm willing to leave him in power. That was a critical aspect of the whole process that I illuminate in my book. But the Anglo-American relationship, the Tony Blair, George W. Bush relationship, is an extraordinarily interesting one. And importantly, it becomes more and more important, actually, in the years after my book ends in 2004, 2005, 2006. My book ends in the summer of 2003. But that Blair-Bush relationship becomes more and more important. And one of the things Mark Lawrence asked, one of the things that will really help us in understanding the whole policy of the administration is when we get the records of the Bush-Blair conversations that took place, video conferences that took place very, very frequently. Plenty of people have wanted those transcripts, and I believe those transcripts will eventually become available, but so far they have not been, but they would be very revealing.
Thank you, Professor. And lastly, this is an important question I would like to ask. This is related to the war in Ukraine. Like, we are living in a world when we are witnessing another invasion, and Russia never called it a war. It justified as a special military operation to denazify. But when it came to West, the West termed it as a war, and Russia so-called Iraq as an invasion. So the West counterclaimed that it was not an invasion, it was an intervention for democracy. So, my question is to you as well as our other panelists, and this would be my last question, basically. So, as we are scholars of international history, how should we justify which war is just or humane, and which one is unjust or inhumane? Because for me, war / invasion or / intervention, the line of clarity seems very thin.
Well, my instinct immediately is to say, I'd welcome to hear what Mark and Arne Westad say about this before I venture an opinion. I do have an opinion. So it's not fair. Let me just say one salient point that I think relates to your question. I think assessing the moral and ethical justifications for war is always an extraordinarily complex question. But I think the temptation today that exists in much of the world to equate Putin, Ukraine with Bush, Saddam Hussein is absolutely wrong. I think the effort, that equation is absolutely wrong because it suggests that Zelensky has no more justification for what he's doing than did Saddam Hussein. It suggests that Saddam Hussein and Zelensky were similar people, similar leaders with similar legitimacy. And that is absolutely wrong to think that Zelensky is like Saddam Hussein and therefore Putin's going after Zelensky is similar to Bush's going after Saddam Hussein. I would never morally justify going to war in Iraq in 2003, but I would always argue that Saddam Hussein was an extraordinarily repressive tyrant who was barbaric and megalomania and filled with megalomania. And the desire to get rid of him was a legitimate desire. That is not to say that going to war was justified. I don't think anyone could say those things about Zelensky in Ukraine, that he was a repressive, cruel, aggressive, adventurous, megalomaniac leader. So I think making those parallels is extremely dangerous and wrong-headed.
Could I jump in on this one, Sumava, because I got to run in a couple of minutes, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is the
so this is a point where I think there is I mean, there's some agreement and some disagreement between myself and Mel. Of course, I agree with his characteristics of the differences between the massive differences between the government in Kiev and Saddam's regime. But the problem here, and the problem particularly in the global south, in the post-colonial world that has quite recently achieved its own sovereignty, is this idea that in terms of interventions by great powers, that you can differentiate between whether the regime in power that has international recognition in any country can be ranked on a list of countries that are so awful that you ought to see intervention in a different light than countries that look much better. That, I think, is the problem from the side of so many post-colonial states. And I think it's important on the US side to realize that, because this is not necessarily, I mean, certainly not about liking Saddam Hussein, who was even in his own time reviled, not least within the global south, for his extreme brutality, and also his aggression against others, his invasion and attempted takeover of Kuwait, which should not be forgotten on this. But it has to do with the whole argument about interventionisms and legitimacy, and at the end of the day, I think sovereignty, which is problematic. I'm not saying that this is easy, but it needs to be paid much more attention to, I think, on the side of great powers overall, and maybe particularly given this track record, recent track record, the United States. On your question, Sumava, or the question that came up with regard to legitimate wars. So I believe very firmly that there are legitimate wars, that there may even under extreme circumstances, but they have to be very extreme to me, arguments for preventive war. I don't think, and this is where Professor Leffler and I agree, that those arguments were there with regard to Iraq in 2003. But I do believe it's important, given the lessons that we're trying to draw from this, that we try to recalibrate our ideas, particularly from a great power perspective, of what is legitimate in terms of war. And I think the direction we should go in with regard to that is to emphasize the right to self-defense in a much more direct way. I mean, for instance, just use an example. I think the US intervention in Afghanistan was a legitimate act of war under international law because it was undertaken against Al-Qaeda in self-defense. I don't think the continued US occupation of Afghanistan and the putting in place of a new regime in Afghanistan was legitimate. I also think it was misguided and ultimately failed, as we will see. So I become much more restrictive on these kinds of issues than what I was before the early 2000s, in part in order to try to use international law as a way of civilizing the power of great powers into being more restrictive on intervention. Apologies for having to run.
So quickly, Professor Lawrence, and then we will.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I mean, these are such eloquent contributions. I would only say ditto to a lot of what has been said. The only point I would add, though, is maybe to highlight the difference between the two Gulf Wars, right? In 1990, the George H.W. Bush administration, it seems to me, got a lot of deserved praise for cobbling together a very broad coalition, which reflected a certain amount, not perfect by any stretch, but a certain amount of buy-in from nations of the global South, right? It's a very broad coalition. And this has, of course, been contrasted with the much more limited coalition of 2002. And I think the greater success in that earlier moment conferred, a higher degree of legitimacy that actually really did matter, and speaks to Arne Westad's point about the need to account for the sometimes quite different perceptions in the global South of what constitutes legitimacy and what is the historical background that is crucial to understand contemporary crises and to form moralistic judgments about who's in the right, when it comes to cross-border aggression. So again, the breadth of that international legitimacy, it seems to me, is something that should be pretty high on the list of American preoccupations when contemplating actions like the one that the Bush administration took in 2002.
Thank you so much, Professor. And it was really a nice evening talking to all of you, Professor Leffler, Professor Lawrence, and Professor Westad also. And for viewers, I would like to recommend that you all read this book. It is very authoritative and provides major analysis of the 2003 invasion of Iraq and US foreign policy. It would be a great asset for foreign policy and international relations enthusiasts. So thank you so much for joining us.
I just want to thank you for this opportunity, and I wish you again terrific success with your organization. And thanks to Mark and to Arne Westad. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Smava. Thank you, Mel.